Good morning and welcome to the Point. It was 5 years ago that you were asked to decide if medical marijuana use in Michigan would be legal. A majority of the people voting said yes. But since that time, the medical marijuana law has created a lot of confusion. Some cities say they don't want dispensaries. Others say they don't want medical marijuana use at all. But still, the law is in place. So how do you clear up the confusion? We recently had that discussion with the leader of the Democrats in the state Senate, Senator Gretchen Whitmer. But our conversation went beyond medical marijuana to talk about small amounts of marijuana for recreational use. That's all part of our conversation this morning with Senator Gretchen Whitmer. Senator, we were just talking before we went on this program about the things that we sometimes think are going to be important, the things that are sometimes going to get, as we say in the business, legs politically. If you would have talked to me about decriminalizing marijuana, even a few years ago, even when you were a freshman senator, I would have said, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't have legs. But since then, 2008, people in the state of Michigan said yes to medical marijuana, and now you're saying you might like to take it further.
Well, that's right. You know, times are changing, Rick, and I think that it's incumbent on the legislature to lead, not just to represent, but that would be a step in the right direction from my perspective, because I think what we're seeing across the state is this interest in decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana for personal use. Now, this wasn't something that I introduced, but because of some bills that were running through the legislature, it was an opportunity to start talking about this. We had a bill before us to streamline the process for an out-of-state corporation to come in and do medicinal marijuana. And only one person testified on behalf of the bill. Everyone else who showed up and testified in that 2.5-hour committee meeting were patients or patient advocates that were frustrated with a system in Michigan that's not working very well. In 2008, we amended our Constitution to permit marijuana for medicinal use, and since then we've got red tape, we've got muddy laws, we've got really we've created a system where patients are not getting access. They don't have access to medicinal marijuana. So it spurred this discussion. Why don't we really talk about decriminalizing it across the state?
I want to go back to 2008. There was a ballot initiative that I believe, and this is the way I view this after talking to some of the people who were behind it, that was intentionally vague when it was proposed, when it was approved, and when it was put out there. Because some of the people who supported it, not all of them, but some of those at the very base, were looking for a larger forum for marijuana. I think that they're on record as saying that. But be that as it may, as an attorney, you know that that language is very important, and if that language is interpreted differently in different places, that creates a certain amount of confusion, at the very worst chaos, and I would suggest that's what has happened with the medical marijuana laws. We have one city here in our viewing area that went to court to say you can't do this at all. Dispensaries have been closed or raided. Some places make it much easier, some places make it much tougher. Some people have taken advantage by having dozens of cards from different patients so they can grow dozens and dozens more plants than perhaps the law intended. But again, I don't know if we know. Do you think that the initiative itself, the language itself, starts with part of the problem by not being specific?
Well, I think there's a case to be made. But at the end of the day, the voters approved medicinal use of marijuana.
Yeah, they approved the language of which I speak, so you're right.
And so I think at that point, it was incumbent on the sitting Attorney General, who was Mike Cox, to come forward and help promulgate some rules that help to ensure that people have access to medicinal marijuana. He did not do that. For whatever reason, the Attorney General kind of washed his hands of it, and we saw dispensaries crop up, we saw litigation start to happen, and now you see that we've got different rules in different places, and that's not good for patients. The whole goal was to ensure that people had access to marijuana because it helps ease their pain, it helps stimulate their appetite. 2008 was a watershed year for a couple of reasons, because we also had the stem cell initiative on the ballot, and I was very active in that.
You were much more active in that than you were in the...
I was. And you know what? We got it passed because people chose cures. People chose patients over the, conspiracy theories and scare tactics. Medicinal marijuana passed with an even greater margin than the stem cell research did. And that's because people wanted to do something on behalf of patients. Now, I'll tell you, I cared for my mother in her last days of brain cancer. She lived for 20 months. She was told she would only have 2 to 6 months. She lived pretty well, but I would have given anything to ease her suffering. And that's why I embraced not only the stem cell research as a potential for cures, but also medicinal marijuana. And when I sit in a committee and we have patient advocate after patient advocate, a dad who brought his sick son to speak, I think Michigan deserves an answer, a clear-cut access for our patients. And if we're not going to do that, maybe we should look at what's going on in a lot of communities around our state. Just a week and a half ago in Lansing, Ferndale, and Jackson, another vote to decriminalize. Overwhelming majorities passing these things. That's a conversation I think it's long overdue at the state.
Let's talk about this as a technical matter. First, with medical marijuana. We know that law is on the books. The people voted for that. We know it has been interpreted a number of different ways. Is there a way that you can go back legislatively and either rewrite rules, working with whomever you need to, if it's the now Attorney General and the Governor, whomever, or with the legislature and write the rules, or do you need to pass new legislation to change and or clarify? And if you need to do that, don't you have to have supermajorities to change something that has been passed by ballot initiative?
I think there are a couple different ways that we can do this, but we're never going to get anywhere, we're never going to make progress on this if we don't roll up our sleeves and start that. I think that we need to take testimony, we need to examine, we need to hear from law enforcement as well. We need to understand where we are having problems across the state, and then I do think we need a state solution, whether or not that requires a supermajority or if there's a way to do it with a simple majority in the legislature. I think it's long overdue. 5 years is a long time to have this ambiguous law where we have patients who don't have access. We owe it to our constituents to have this debate and to do it right now, fully, in a transparent way, and to include all the stakeholders so we get it right. We've seen 5 years of getting it wrong. It's time for us to try to get this right.
And I should point out that no matter what people's view is on medical marijuana, that after this passed and became law, the confusion has come thereafter. So the vote was pretty clear, at least people voting on whatever they believed it was, but what has happened afterwards has been confusion, and that's what you talk about clearing up as the first issue. But then there's the other issue, and you talk about decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana, as you point out, has just been voted on in a number of metropolitan areas over the past year or a couple of years. As an attorney, you realize that too creates problems. I mean, not the least of which, and we already know that the federal government has chosen not to enforce its ban in many other places where this has happened, but it still does violate federal law, even if it is legal locally. But if you do that on a city-by-city basis, as is being done now, that creates some confusion too, because in a city, for example, let's take Lansing, they could be, the city could be covered by the City of Lansing Police, which might understand and be bound by whatever was voted on by the city commission there. But the county sheriff's department or Michigan State Police might not be as aware or might not be willing to enforce it the same way. That creates a problem, doesn't
it? Right, it does, and I think that we've got different standards in different municipalities as it is. We have law enforcement that has got all sorts of different directives coming, whether it's an attorney general in Washington, D.C. who's not going to prosecute, but you never know what the next attorney general is going to do. You've got Lansing, who just overwhelmingly said we are going to decriminalize small amounts. You've got Ann Arbor, who has smaller penalties. So, we've got different standards for different areas, and that's not really a very workable solution. Now, is it time for us to have the conversation about decriminalization? Yes, I think it is. I think it's long overdue. It would alleviate the problems with regard to people in the medicinal marijuana, but it would also could make a lot of sense for our state. Right now, when you look at our prison system and how much it costs us to incarcerate people, we have seen some law enforcement types come out and say, this is something that makes sense. We don't have the resources or the time to prosecute and to investigate and to go after people who are in possession of small amounts. This is something that makes sense. I think it's a debate that we need to have.
So what would happen if marijuana, at least in small amounts, became legal here in the state of Michigan? Would it have an impact on prisons? Would it have an impact on the amount of money the state has to pay for prisoners? That's part of our conversation when we continue. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We recently sat down with Senator Gretchen Whitmer to talk to her about the use of medical marijuana. There is some consensus in Lansing that the state's law needs to be clarified because of the unequal interpretation across the state. But we also talked to her about the possibility that some small amounts of recreational marijuana could be legalized in the state. Now, that's a conversation that's only just begun, but we talked to Senator Whitmer, who is also an attorney, about what that would look like and what it could do to the prison population and the cost of incarceration in the state of Michigan. When you talk about, and I don't want to get too far off the beaten track, but you brought this up, and this intrigues me because I have heard people talk about this now from both sides of the aisle. When you talk about putting people in jail or putting them specifically in prison at an enormous cost in the state of Michigan, far more than it costs to educate children, and we've talked about education for years. But the phrase that I hear, and again, increasingly from both sides, is that we have to decide who we're going to put in jail, people that we're afraid of or people that we're mad at. And very often it's the people that are dealing those low levels of drugs because of the societal pressure that may not be, according to some professionals in both the legal part of the world and law enforcement part of the world, that say aren't necessarily dangerous, but we may be mad at because they're doing something that we've said you can't do. If you decided to look at that as far as sentencing guidelines, would you like to look at other sentencing guidelines for other controlled substances and other lower level offenses, given the size of Michigan's prison population?
Well, there's no question that we've got an enormous prison population, that we are spending so much money to incarcerate people in our state. You know, there are a lot of good reasons that some of those people are locked up, and I certainly am not proposing that we just unlock our prisons by any stretch. You know, I think by and large, you know, the people that are in our prisons are there for good reason. When it comes to these low-level drug offenses, though, I think that that's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and I think that a lot of people in our state feel that same way. If we had a discussion where we talked about regulating marijuana, where we talked about taxing marijuana and making sure that, you know, it's of a specific grade, so it's not as dangerous as some of the things that we see on our street, I think that that's something that really makes a lot of sense to a lot of people across our state. And I'll tell you, I've talked to a number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who think that that is something that sounds reasonable. Are they going to come out and say, endorse this right now? Probably not, but I do think that the conversations are starting to evolve, and it gives me hope that at some point we're going to move the ball forward on this issue, and we are going on a lot of other progressive issues. 13 years ago, when I first came into the legislature, I don't think I ever would have talked about decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana.
No, we talked about this just before we started. I believe you could have ended your career in your first two, really, if you would have done that a decade ago.
Or talking about same-sex marriage. And that is a part of our common debate that is happening here in this country. And I think it's a great thing. I don't think people should be scared of that. We should welcome this debate. We should make educated decisions and make sure that the legislature is promulgating law that reflects what the citizens of Michigan want and see for our future.
You touched on this a bit, but here's a question for you. If you're going to produce beer, which we do a lot of in Michigan, or wine, which we do a lot of in Michigan, or spirits, which we don't do a lot of, but if you're going to do any of those things, you're regulated. You're regulated about how much and how you produce it. You're taxed. You're told how and where and when and how, all of that, to sell it. Mm-hmm. So would you then be in favor, and you already said part of this, but would you be in favor from starting from the seed, if you will, and saying you're going to regulate who grows it, how they grow it, where they grow it, how they market it, how they, you know, do you sell it through liquor stores, how you tax it? Are you talking about taking marijuana as we know it today and turning it more into a commodity from the state perspective that would be sold in perhaps liquor stores, someplace like that, or pharmacies? Is that? I know that's getting ahead of the game, but I'm just trying to think about this because the natural result of that is in addition to getting what you may want out of this for decriminalization, it may also become a revenue stream.
Right.
If you do that.
Well, and I'm glad that you're thinking that way. That's the point, is to try to spur this type of a conversation, to spur people to start thinking, what would that look like? What would that mean? One of the things that I would not want to do, though, is to take people who are, patient advocates who are currently growing medicine. I don't want to preclude them from doing that. And so when we do talk about doing this on a bigger scale and making it more of a commodity, I certainly wouldn't want to take the ability of people to grow their medicine out of I want to keep that right for them. I think that that's important. And that is a fear that they have when you see this corporation coming into Michigan and potentially doing pharmaceutical grade. They're worried that that means that they're going to lose their rights. I do not want to do that. I want to ensure that those rights are protected. But ultimately, on the bigger picture, I think that there are lessons to be learned about what's happening in other states. You look at what's happening in Colorado, that is potential revenue stream for the state. It is a way to decriminalize something that I think that the masses see as something that might make sense. And so, yeah, I think that's the discussion we need to have.
If you have the discussion, if you can get enough people to at least sit down at the table, then ultimately that's something that gets back to the ballot, right? It's not something you do legislatively.
I believe so, but certainly that's how we try to come up with answers, right?
Right.
Asking all the right questions, asking people in the medical profession, the legal profession, the law enforcement, but most importantly, what do the people of the state of Michigan want?
This is an interesting op-ed that you wrote, and I don't know how widely this was disseminated. When I first searched it, the first copy I came up was in the Tennessean. And that was out there. So this has been picked up in more than a few places. Conversation about legalizing marijuana by somebody who's the leader of the Democrats in the Senate in a state like Michigan is going to get some notoriety. Is that a good thing for the state of Michigan if people around the country are saying, hey, they're talking about becoming a state like Colorado or like Washington and Oregon to different degrees that may decriminalize marijuana? Is that a good thing that people associate with the state?
I think one of the things that is incumbent on me as a lawmaker is to spur a conversation. That's one of the benefits from this. I also tell you, we've proposed the Michigan 2020 plan that I know you're familiar with, modeled after the Kalamazoo Promise, to ensure every kid in Michigan has college, whether it's 4-year, 2-year, or a trade school, paid for. My job is to try to get people to start having this debate. That's what I'm elected to do, to represent the people that elected me, but also to push forward a responsible conversation and some robust debate like our founders envisioned. Yes, I think it is good for people to look at Michigan and say, wow, they're really talking about moving forward on some ideas that make sense to people. That, I think, is a good thing for Michigan.
Now, I have to ask you this because this is what your critics are going to say. You wouldn't have said this 2 years ago before running for re-election, that you are in your final term as a state senator. You've got a couple of years to try to get something done, and this might be something that you want to get done, but you wouldn't have done it until then. If you were up for re-election next year, would you be talking about this?
Absolutely. I don't know what I'll be doing 2 years from now, 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, but I think this is the right thing to do, is to spur this conversation. It's long overdue, and it's time Michigan legislature start leading as opposed to lagging behind everyone else in the nation.
I'm going to save that last soundbite when you say you don't know what you'll be doing 2 years from now, 4 years from now, or 8 years from now. We may come back and revisit that in 2 or 4 or 8 years.
We'll see.
Let me talk about something else that's being discussed right now. The Democratic Party has a candidate for governor right now, only one it would appear, and that is the man who used to sit in the chair that you sit in, Mark Schauer, former leader over in the Senate of the Democrats. And just this week, he said he wants the minimum wage increased in Michigan to, if I'm not mistaken, $9.25 over a period of time. That's something that we've heard from some of your other colleagues too. I know that I've talked with some members who have said, look, if you want people to be able to exist in an environment where there are so many minimum wage jobs, you've got to raise that minimum wage. People across the aisle largely, and a lot of business people say no. If you raise the minimum wage, what you will do is increase the wage for fewer people because there'll be fewer people in the job market. Where do you stand on raising the minimum wage?
Well, I think it's long overdue. We do need to raise the minimum wage. I'm glad that Mark Schauer has the temerity to say that publicly and to push for that. I think that when you look at the average person in Michigan and how they make a living and how great a struggle it is for so many, raising the minimum wage to $9 an hour, I mean, that's just long overdue, and I support Mark on that, and I think that this is a debate that we're gonna see develop over the next year.
Does it concern you that when people talk about the fact that, yeah, I mean, we can do that, but we're not going to be able to employ as many people or give people as many hours? Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
Well, it concerns me, of course. You know, whenever the business community speaks with a united voice, I think it's worth listening to. I do also think, though, you can see businesses in other states that have a more livable wage, that they are still continue to thrive, that is not the end all be all of whether or not a business is profitable. And so the most important thing, that whether you're a business that employs minimum wage workers or a business that employs the creative class, we've got to have a talented workforce in the state of Michigan. That's the most important thing that business tell us that they need. It's not about taxes, it's not about wage levels, it's about having the talent in Michigan, and that's why it's important that we invest in our people.
As I said at the beginning of this segment, the conversation about legalizing even small amounts of recreational marijuana in the state has just begun. There's no indication that there's any rush to get that done in Lansing, nor is there any indication there's enough support in the legislature. Ultimately, it probably would have to be a ballot initiative, and so far we've seen no signs that one is being put together. But we'll continue to keep an eye on that. And we'll be back with more of our conversation to the point. Well, it's November, and it's not an election year. That means we must have a big election just around the corner, and certainly in the state of Michigan, that's true. A U.S. Senate seat will be open. The race for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, every member of the state Senate and House, as well as all those U.S. House seats, all up for a vote. We also talked to the senator about the upcoming election. There's a big election coming up next year. Everything, as far as you can see, is up for re-election or election. Every seat in the Senate, every seat in the House, every seat in the U.S. House, plus one U.S. Senate seat, the governor's races we've talked about, all the constitutional offices. Last time around, Democrats ended up in the minority in both the House, and I don't need to tell you, in the Senate. It's a big, big step to take back the Senate for Democrats. There'd be a lot of seats you'd have to come up with. Over in the House, much fewer seats that have to switch. I know it's a long way out. We're a year out from the general election, and I'm not going to play this back and say, I told you so or you told me so, but the question is, how do you feel right now, almost a year out from the election, for Democrats, just legislatively, because that's where you've had your career in both the House and Senate. How do you think this looks for them in November of next year?
I feel good about our prospects. I will tell you, I think that the Republicans have overreached, whether it was, the systematic divestment of our schools, where you see class sizes climbing, or the pension tax, or trying to get rid of the earned income tax credit, all for a business tax break that hasn't yielded jobs for the state of Michigan. I feel pretty good about our prospects, because we do have a vision to move Michigan forward. I'll tell you, anyone who watched the last election knows that Michigan's not a red state or a blue state. We're a state that desperately wants leadership, and I do believe that the Democratic values more align with the state of Michigan values, and I think next year is going to be a good year.
Of course, we'll have to wait and see exactly how Decision 2014 turns out. Not everyone who's going to run has announced, and not everyone who's announced will necessarily run. It's a long time between now and next November, and we, of course, will continue to keep an eye on exactly who decides to throw their hat in the ring. Now, a program note coming up next. Meet the Press remembers JFK, the presidential campaign. The program that comes up next here on Wood TV will commemorate the anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's death 50 years ago this weekend, and his rise to the presidency. It will feature 3 Meet the Press interviews with JFK during the 1960 presidential campaign. That's all coming up next on Meet the Press, remembering JFK. And we'll be here every Sunday morning. I hope you'll join us at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV for To the Point.